They were never alone in the house, but they were always alone inside themselves. Nobody noticed, nobody asked. And somehow that became the part that hurt the most. They learned to carry it quietly, to smile at the right moments, to seem perfectly fine, but the loneliness never left. It simply learned to wear better and more convincing disguises. If you grew up in the 1970s, or if you love someone who did, what you are about to hear in this video will finally name something that has lived quietly beneath the surface of an entire generation for decades, without anyone giving it the precise and honest language it has always deserved. This is not about people who lacked family or friendship or the ordinary social textures of a full childhood. This is about something more specific, more subtle, and in many ways more difficult to heal than the loneliness that comes from simple physical isolation. This is about the loneliness of being present in a room full of people who love you and feeling completely unseen by every single one of them. The loneliness of having an interior life so rich and so complex and so full of things that needed to be said, that it pressed against the inside of the chest like something that had no door and no window and no available exit into the world outside. That specific loneliness was the quiet inheritance of an entire generation, and most of them are still carrying it today, without fully understanding what it actually is or where it came from. Most people who look at the childhoods of people raised in the 1970s reach a familiar and completely understandable conclusion about what they are observing when they examine the surface of those years. They see children who had neighborhoods full of other children, who played outside from morning until evening, who had siblings and cousins and school friends and church communities and every outward appearance of a richly populated social world. They conclude that loneliness could not possibly have been a significant feature of that childhood landscape. That conclusion is built on a misunderstanding of what loneliness actually is, at its most fundamental psychological level. Loneliness is not the absence of other people in the physical environment. Loneliness is the absence of genuine emotional contact with other people, the experience of moving through a populated world without ever being truly seen, truly heard, or truly known by anyone present in that world, who has the power and the willingness to make genuine contact with the full interior reality of who you actually are underneath everything visible. To understand the specific texture of the loneliness that was so common in 1970s childhoods, it is necessary to be honest about what emotional availability looked like inside the typical household of that era, and what children encountered when they brought their interior world to the adults who were supposed to be its primary, witnesses and guardians across the most vulnerable and formative years of their entire lives. Parents of the 1970s were not emotionally available in the way that modern developmental psychology would recognize as adequate for a child's full emotional development and psychological well-being. This was not because they did not love their children with genuine depth and real commitment. It was because they themselves had been raised inside environments where emotional availability was not modeled, not valued, not understood as a parental responsibility, and not practiced as a normal feature of healthy family life between adults and the children who depended on them completely. A father who came home from work exhausted and sat behind a newspaper was not making a conscious decision to emotionally abandon his children in the hours between dinner and bedtime. He was doing exactly what his own father had done, in exactly the way his own nervous system understood rest and recovery, and the appropriate management of the boundary between the adult world and the child world, operating simultaneously inside the same physical space every single evening. A mother who managed the household with efficiency and warmth, but who deflected every emotionally significant conversation with practical redirection, was not choosing emotional unavailability as a deliberate parenting philosophy. She was operating from the only emotional template she had ever been given, one in which feelings were acknowledged briefly, if at all, managed privately, and then set aside in favor of the concrete and manageable demands of daily functioning that at least had clear solutions available. The child living inside this environment was not mistreated in any way that the era would have recognized or named as harmful. They were fed. They were clothed. They were sent to school and brought to church and given birthday presents, and taken on occasional family vacations that produced photographs showing everyone smiling in the appropriate places. By every external and measurable standard of the time, they were having a perfectly adequate childhood and had absolutely nothing legitimate to complain about. But something was missing from that childhood that the child felt with their entire body, even before they had any language to describe what the absence actually was, or why it produced the specific quality of hollow ache that settled into. Their chest on quiet Sunday afternoons when the house was full of people and the loneliness was somehow loudest and most insistent precisely because of all the company surrounding it on every side. What was missing was the experience of being genuinely curious about as a person, of having an adult look at them with the specific quality of attention that communicates not just affection but genuine interest in what is happening inside this particular child's mind and heart and developing interior world. The question that would have made the difference was not complicated or demanding. It was simply, what are you thinking about? What does that feel like? Tell me something real about what it is like to be you today. That question was not asked with any regularity in the typical 1970s household, not because the adults present did not care about the children living alongside them, but because the adults themselves had never been asked that question during their own childhoods, and had therefore never developed the internal architecture or the conversational habits that asking it and receiving its answer with genuine presence and patience actually requires from a person trying to offer it. Psychologists studying what they call emotional neglect, which is distinct from physical neglect and far more difficult to identify, name, and treat because it consists entirely of what was absent rather than what was actively harmful, have documented a specific and consistent cluster of long-term effects that develop in children raised in emotionally unavailable environments, regardless of how loving or well-intentioned the adults in those environments genuinely were, across the years of the child's development. Children raised with chronic emotional unavailability from their primary caregivers develop what researchers describe as a fundamental uncertainty about the validity of their own inner experience. Because their feelings were never consistently witnessed, named, and confirmed as real and important by a trusted adult, they grow into adults who carry a quiet but persistent suspicion that what they feel may not be accurate, may not be proportionate, may not be something that other people would consider worthy of genuine attention or compassionate acknowledgement if it were ever brought fully into the open. This suspicion does not prevent them from feeling. People who grew up inside emotional neglect frequently feel with extraordinary depth and sensitivity that surprises even themselves when they encounter it. What it prevents is the willingness to trust those feelings as reliable guides, to share them without immediate self-censorship and qualification, or to ask for the emotional support that those feelings are clearly indicating they need from the people currently available to provide it in their adult lives. The result is a specific kind of adult loneliness that is in many ways more difficult and more persistent than the loneliness of simple social isolation. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who care about you, while remaining convinced at some level below conscious articulation that if those people could see everything you actually are, every complicated feeling, every dark and inconvenient interior landscape, every need that does not fit neatly into the composed and functional version of yourself that you have learned to present the care, would not survive the full exposure of what it was actually being asked to hold. The 1970s added specific cultural dimensions to this already difficult developmental experience that amplified its effects in ways that are worth understanding clearly. The era operated with a collective belief that children were naturally resilient, that they bounced back from difficulty without lasting effect, and that the emotional experiences of childhood were transitional by definition, something children moved through and left behind naturally as they developed into competent and functional adults who no longer needed the things that children needed. This belief meant that the loneliness children were experiencing was not identified as something requiring adult attention or intervention. It was not seen at all. Adults around those children were not withholding a response to something they recognized as distress. They were genuinely not registering the distress as distress in the first place, because the cultural framework they were operating inside had not equipped them with either the language or the observational lens that would have made the child's interior suffering visible to them as something real and significant and worthy of a response. A child who was lonely in that era had no available framework for understanding their own experience as something legitimate and communicable to the adults around them. The word loneliness itself, when applied to a child living in a full household in a full neighborhood with a full schedule of school and play and family activity, would have been met with genuine confusion by most adults of that period, who understood loneliness as a condition of physical isolation rather than a condition of emotional invisibility occurring simultaneously with physical proximity. So the child did what children in that era consistently and intelligently did when they encountered an interior experience that the environment had no language for and no tolerance for. They took it inside. They built an accommodation around it. They develop the capacity to function with complete apparent normalcy on the surface of their daily lives, while carrying something unaddressed and unnamed in the deeper interior layers of their experience that never received attention that would have allowed it to resolve and integrate rather than simply calcify into a permanent feature of the emotional landscape. The specific ways this unhealed loneliness manifests in the adult lives of people raised in the 1970s follow patterns that are consistent enough across individuals to be immediately recognizable once you know what to look for beneath the surface of otherwise functional and competent adult lives. There is a characteristic difficulty with asking for help that goes significantly deeper than ordinary self-reliance or personal preference for independence in managing practical challenges. The difficulty with asking for help in people carrying this particular history is rooted in something more fundamental than pride or practical preference. It is rooted in a deeply encoded conviction, installed during the years when the brain was most impressionable and most actively building its templates for understanding how relationships work, that needs presented to other people produce burden rather than connection and withdrawal, rather than the warm approach of genuine care and willingness to be present. There is also a characteristic pattern in close relationships that people carrying this loneliness recognize immediately when it is named clearly the experience of being genuinely loved by someone who is consistently present, consistently demonstrating their care and commitment, and simultaneously feeling a quality of unreachable distance from that love that no amount of its genuine warmth and consistency seems capable of fully closing. The love is real, the care is visible, and still something fundamental remains just slightly out of reach in a way that is as frustrating as it is difficult to explain to the person offering everything they have. This distance is not a reflection of the quality of the love being offered in the present relationship. It is a reflection of the original wound. The nervous system's learned certainty that genuine emotional contact is not something that lasts, not something that can be fully trusted, and not something that is available to them in the complete and unconditional form that the child they once were needed and did not reliably receive from the environment they were placed inside without choosing it. Healing this specific wound requires something that cannot be rushed and cannot be forced into a therapeutic timeline that makes more sense to the mind than it does to the nervous system carrying the original injury. It requires the accumulated experience of being genuinely seen across time, not in a single transformative moment of emotional breakthrough, but in the ordinary repeated moments of daily relationship where someone looks at you with consistent curiosity and consistent presence and does not look away when what they see is complicated or inconvenient or more than the composed surface you initially offered them. It requires relationships with people who ask the question that was never asked often enough during the years when it would have made the most difference. What are you thinking about? What does that feel like? Tell me something real, and then stay. Stay present through the answer. Stay present through the silence that sometimes precedes the answer when the person being asked is still learning, after all these decades, that speaking is worth the risk of what might happen in the space between the offering and the response. If you grew up in the 1970s and you recognize the loneliness this video has been describing, the particular quality of it, the way it persists beneath everything you have built and everyone you have loved, and every way you have learned to function beautifully on the surface of a life that sometimes still feels strangely unreachable from the inside, please hear this, and let it settle somewhere that needs it. You are not too much. You are not invisible because you deserve to be. You are invisible because the people around you had never been taught how to truly see anyone, including themselves. The loneliness you carried was never a verdict about your worth. It was a gap in what was available to you during the years when you needed it most and could not yet go anywhere else to find it. That gap can close. Not all at once and not without patience, and not without the willingness to let people in further than the trained caution of a lifetime has been telling you is safe. But it can close. And you deserve to feel what is on the other side of it. If this video reached something true in you today, share it with someone who has been carrying this quietly and has never had the language to say what it actually is. And subscribe now, because this series exists to give language to the things that a whole generation was handed without words and has been carrying in silence ever since.